Okay, so when we talk about evolution, I think most of us, our minds immediately jump to Charles Darwin, right? Natural selection.
Yeah, absolutely. It's foundational. It shaped how we understand, well, all of life's diversity.
But here's a thought. What if that story, the one about gradual change, competition driving everything,
hmm
what if it isn't the whole story?
Or at least, what if for a really long time, some, well, brilliant minds were proposing completely different ways life might have changed?
Exactly. Different mechanisms altogether.
And what's so fascinating here, I think, is that these thinkers, they generally accepted that life evolves. That wasn't really the debate for many of them.
Ah, okay, so they bought into evolution happening.
Right. The core disagreement wasn't if, it was how. So today, we're not really here to debate Darwinism itself.
No.
Instead, we're going to dive into these other explanations, these alternatives for the mechanism of evolution. Some are compelling, some may be a bit surprising, and they existed right alongside Darwin's ideas, often challenging them head-on.
So that's our mission for this deep dive then. To explore this, rich history of scientific ideas. Some physical, some maybe more philosophical.
Uh-huh. All questioning if natural selection was the only game in town, or even the main one.
We'll look at why these alternatives came up, what they were actually suggesting, and this is the really interesting part to me, how some of them, even after being kind of pushed aside by the modern synthesis,
Yeah.
they're making a comeback, finding new life because of discoveries in molecular biology. It's pretty wild.
It really is. And our source for diving into all this is a great overview from Wikipedia on alternatives to Darwinian evolution. It maps out this whole intellectual journey really well.
Perfect. So let's start by setting the stage, historically speaking. Before evolution really took hold, what was the dominant idea?
Well, you have to go way back. The prevailing view, going all the way back to Aristotle and ancient Greece, was basically unchanging forms.
Unchanging forms. So
Yeah.
species just stay the same.
Pretty much. Aristotle talked about eidos, the immutable essence of a species. It always bred true to its ideal form. This idea kind of morphed over time.
Into the great chain of being. I remember that from school.
Exactly, the stala naturae. Thinkers like Ramon Lull in the Middle Ages developed it. It depicted this fixed hierarchy of life, implying everything was set in stone from creation.
Okay, so if forms are fixed, that's a massive roadblock for any idea of evolution, not just Darwin's.
A monumental one. And then you get figures like Georges Cuvier in 1812 with his correlation of parts.
Correlation of parts. What did he mean by that?
He argued that an organism is like this perfectly integrated machine, an irreducible whole. Every part fits and works together for a specific function.
Right.
So for Cuvier, if you changed one part, the whole system would be thrown off balance. Everything else would have to change at the exact same time to compensate.
Which makes gradual single-part evolution seem, well, impossible from his viewpoint.
Utterly impossible. He couldn't see how it could work.
And isn't it ironic that Herbert Spencer, the guy who actually coined survival of the fittest, he used a similar argument against natural selection?
It's incredibly ironic. Yeah, Spencer thought it was just too improbable that all the right random variations would pop up at the same time in the right way.
So what did he think happened?
He leaned more towards a Lamarckian idea, where parts adapted simultaneously because of how they were used or not used, a more directed change.
Okay, this is key then. By the early 20th century, scientists weren't really arguing if evolution happened anymore.
Broadly speaking, no. The fact of evolution was pretty widely accepted among biologists. The real battleground was the mechanism.
That'll work.
Exactly. And Darwin's natural selection was actually, for several decades, in what historians call an eclipse. It wasn't the dominant explanation.
An eclipse of Darwinism. Why? What drove scientists to look for these other non-Darwinian mechanisms? Was it purely scientific disagreement?
Not entirely. There were definitely scientific concerns, which we'll get to, but there were other factors too. Moral and religious objections were significant for some.
How so?
Well, natural selection's emphasis on, death, struggle, randomness, competition, it just felt bleak, even immoral to many naturalists.
I could see that. It lacks a sense of purpose, maybe.
Precisely. It didn't leave much room for teleology, purpose, or design in nature, or for any sense of inherent progress in how life developed. People like St. George Jackson Mivart, Charles Lyell, they had deep reservations, often rooted in their faith.
And that idea of progress, that was a big one for others too, wasn't it? Like evolution had to be going somewhere.
Definitely, some thinkers, like Spencer again or the botanist George Henslow, really believe evolution was inherently progressive. Life was moving towards, higher forms.
And random variation plus selection just didn't feel directed enough to explain that perceived trajectory.
Exactly. It felt too haphazard. And then you had idealists like Edward Drinker Cope or Alpheus Hyatt, who saw these orderly patterns in the fossil record that they thought went beyond what selection alone could produce.
Okay, so philosophical and moral objections, a desire for progress. What about the scientific problems people saw with natural selection itself?
Right. There were perceived weaknesses there, too. One big one was time. Could natural selection work fast enough?
Based on the age of the Earth estimates back then?
Yeah, estimates by physicists like Lord Kelvin suggested the Earth was much younger than we know now. Too young, some argued, for gradual selection to produce life's diversity.
And wasn't there a huge problem with how inheritance was understood?
Oh, absolutely. The prevailing idea was blending inheritance, like
Okay.
mixing paint offspring were just a blend of their parents.
Which would dilute any useful new trait,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Flaming Jenkin made this point very powerfully. Any single beneficial variation would just get blended away over a few generations, making selection ineffective. Darwin himself really struggled with this.
So, faced with all these issues, moral, philosophical, scientific, did the way scientists approach biology start to shift? Maybe towards the lab?
That's a really sharp point. Yes, the late 19th and early 20th century saw this huge rise in experimental biology. Geneticists like Hugo de Vries, Thomas Hunt Morgan, they wanted biology to be a rigorous lab-based science. They kind of distrusted the field observations that Darwin and Wallace relied on.
Saw them as maybe anecdotal, less controlled.
Pretty much. They preferred experiments in genetics, physiology, things you could actually measure and repeat in the lab. And this focus tended to push broader, harder-to-test phenomena like natural selection into the background for a while.
It sounds like a fundamental shift in what counted as good science. So with all these reasons to seek alternatives, where do they look first? Inside life itself.
Many did look inward for some kind of fundamental life principle, which brings us to vitalism.
Vitalism. The idea that living things have some kind of special spark, a non-physical force.
That's the gist. A vital spirit that makes them alive, fundamentally different from just complex chemistry and physics. And this idea is ancient, goes way back.
Didn't Louis Pasteur believe something like this? About fermentation needing whole organisms?
He did. He thought only living yeast cells could do it, not just their chemical components. And then you had Hans Driesch's experiments with sea urchin embryos around the turn of the century.
Oh, right, separating the cells.
Yeah, he separated the first two cells, and remarkably, each one developed into a complete, albeit smaller, larva. It seemed like each cell held the entire vital capability to form a whole organism, defying a purely mechanistic view.
That does sound hard to explain mechanically. So why did vitalism fade?
Well, chemistry started providing mechanistic answers. A huge blow was Friedrich Fuller synthesizing urea, an organic compound, from purely inorganic chemicals back in 1828.
Proving you didn't need a vital force from a living organism to make organic molecules.
Exactly. It showed the same chemical laws applied. As more biological processes were explained chemically and physically, vitalism just had less and less territory. By the 1930s, our source says biologists had almost unanimously abandoned it as a scientific explanation.
Okay, so if the vital spark idea was fading, did people still try to incorporate a divine element into evolution? Keep some sense of guidance?
Oh, definitely. That leads directly into theistic evolution. The basic idea is simply that a deity influences the evolutionary process somehow.
And how did people imagine that working?
There were different flavors. Asa Gray, a famous botanist and correspondent of Darwin, suggested in 1876 that God provides the beneficial variations for selection to work on, sort of subtly guiding it.
Okay.
Then you had St. George Jackson Mibart in 1871, who argued God set up preordained laws, almost like an internal program that directed evolution along certain paths. He leaned towards orthogenesis, which we'll get to. The Duke of Argyll had similar ideas about a divine plan unfolding.
But this also fell out of favor within science, didn't it? Why was that?
It really came down to the definition of science itself. By around 1900, the consensus was growing that science must rely on methodological naturalism.
Meaning?
Meaning, scientific explanations can only invoke natural, testable causes and processes. Supernatural intervention, divine guidance. These fall outside what science can empirically test or observe.
So it wasn't necessarily denying a deity's existence.
Not at all. It was about defining the boundaries of scientific inquiry. Theistic evolution, because it invoked the supernatural, failed the test, as the source puts it.
Right. So if direct divine guidance was off the table scientifically, but people still felt life wasn't just random, did they look for some kind of internal but natural direction?
Precisely. And that's where orthogenesis or progressionism comes in. This is a really fascinating one.
Orthogenesis sounds like straight line generation.
Pretty much. It's the hypothesis that life has an innate tendency to evolve in a unilinear way, moving in a specific direction, often towards greater complexity or perceived perfection.
An internal compass for evolution.
Sort of, yeah. And there were many versions. Some, like Teilhard de Chardin's, were quite spiritual. Others, like Theodor Eimer's, tried to be purely biological mechanisms, sometimes even linking it with Lamarckism.
I can see how this would appeal to paleontologists looking at fossil lineages over time.
Did it? Immensely. It was very popular among paleontologists, like Henry Fairfield Osborn at the American Museum of Natural History. They looked at the fossil record and saw what they interpreted as clear, straight-line trends.
Like the Titanidae horns Osborn studied.
Exactly. He argued these horns showed orthogenetic trends. They just kept evolving in a certain direction, seemingly independent of whether it was adaptive or not. Sometimes, he argued, these trends even became detrimental.
The classic example being the Irish elk's enormous antlers.
That's the one. Osborn and others suggested those huge antlers were an orthogenetic trend that just kept going, possibly even contributing to the elk's extinction because they became so unwieldy beyond any adaptive advantage.
So this idea of an internal, pre-programmed evolutionary track, why did it eventually lose favor, especially when the modern synthesis came together?
Support really dropped off during the modern synthesis in the 1940s. The big problem was that orthogenesis couldn't easily explain the actual pattern of evolution revealed by the fossil record and genetics.
Which isn't a straight line at all.
Not at all. It's a branching bush, incredibly complex diversification. Natural selection combined with genetics could explain that branching pattern much better than a theory based on inherent linear trends.
But you hinted earlier, is there a sense in which orthogenesis, or something like it, is seeing a bit of a comeback?
In a way, yes, but it's quite different now. Not the old mystical or purely linear idea. Modern work in the 21st century talks about constrained orthogenesis.
Constrained orthogenesis, okay, what does that involve?
It looks at things like mutation bias, the idea that mutations aren't entirely random in their effects. Some types might be more likely than others. And it looks at developmental constraints, how the process of embryonic development itself might channel evolution down certain paths.
So it's not an internal drive, but more like the available roads for evolution are limited or biased by the underlying biology.
That's a great way to put it. Self-organizing principles in development, the structure of the genome. These things might make certain evolutionary outcomes more probable than others, creating preferred directions without invoking any mysterious forces. It's orthogenesis reimagined through molecular and developmental biology.
That's really fascinating. Okay, so moving away from internal drives and directions, let's talk about how characteristics were thought to be inherited, which brings us inevitably to Lamarckism.
Yes, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. His 1809 theory is probably the most famous alternative. The core idea is the inheritance of acquired characteristics.
So traits developed during life's stronger muscles from use, weaker organs from disuse, could be passed on to offspring.
That was the idea. A giraffe stretching its neck to reach higher leaves would pass on a slightly longer neck, and so on, generation after generation. It was part of his larger view of progressive evolution, too.
What always surprises me is that Darwin himself didn't completely dismiss this. Didn't he include a section on use and disuse in The Origin?
He absolutely did. Chapter 5, Laws of Variation, includes effects of the increased use and disuse of parts. He cites examples like ground birds having stronger legs or ostriches having weaker wings because they don't fly. So the idea had real currency.
And it wasn't just Darwin entertaining it. Who else supported this neo-Lamarckian view?
Oh, it had significant proponents in the late 19th century. People like Ernst Haeckel, Edward Drinker Cope, who we mentioned earlier, and Alpheus Packard. Packard used it to explain things like how cave insects lost their sight over time through disuse.
Makes intuitive sense in a way. George Henslow, the botanist, even thought environmental stress could directly cause inheritable changes.
Right. He focused on variations caused by the environment itself.
So, given its intuitive appeal and proponents, what led to Lamarckism's decline as a major scientific theory?
Two main things, really. First, a persistent lack of convincing experimental evidence. People tried, but demonstrating the inheritance of acquired traits proved incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
And the second thing, was it theoretical?
Very much so. The big blow came from August Weismann and his germplasm theory around the 1880s.
The Weismann barrier.
Exactly. Weismann argued there's a strict separation between the body cells, soma, and the reproductive cells, germline sperm and eggs. Changes acquired by the body, like bigger muscles from lifting weights, couldn't affect the germ cells.
So they couldn't be passed on to the next generation.
Precisely. If you cut off a mouse's tail, its offspring are still born with tails. The acquired change doesn't enter the hereditary information. This theoretical barrier made traditional Lamarckism seem biologically impossible for animals, at least.
Yet, we hear about epigenetics now, which sounds a bit Lamarckian. Is there a connection, or is it fundamentally different?
There are echoes, but it's crucial to understand the difference. Epigenetics studies heritable changes in gene expression, how genes are turned on or off that don't involve changes to the underlying DNA sequence itself.
Okay, so it's not changing the blueprint, just how the blueprint is read.
That's a good analogy. And these epigenetic marks can sometimes be influenced by the environment and can, in certain cases, more clearly in plants and microbes, sometimes in animals, be passed across a generation or two.
But it's not the same as Lamarck's idea.
No, it's generally not seen as directing large-scale evolutionary change in the way Lamarck envisioned. These changes often aren't permanent over many generations, and they don't directly contradict the Weismann barrier in the way originally conceived. It's a fascinating layer of complexity, but not quite Lamarckism reborn.
Got it. So if inheriting acquired traits was out, what about evolution happening in big jumps? Not gradual change, but sudden, large mutations creating new forms.
Ah, yes, that brings us to saltationism, or mutationism. The idea that new species pop into existence rapidly through major mutations, rather than Darwin's slow accumulation of tiny variations.
Sounds traumatic. Who was pushing this idea?
It was particularly popular among the early geneticists around the turn of the 20th century. Figures like Hugo de Vries, one of the rediscoverers of Mendel's work, and William Bateson in the UK. Even Thomas Hunt Morgan, who later became a pillar of the modern synthesis, initially favored large mutations.
And de Vries's work with evening primroses seemed like strong evidence, didn't it? He found new varieties appearing suddenly.
It did seem like it at first. He observed these Anothera plants throwing off new forms, some quite different, single generations. He called them mutations, and thought this was how new species arose.
But that turned out to be something else.
Yeah, later work, especially by Hermann Joseph Muller, showed that de Vries's mutations were mostly due to polyploidy changes in the number of whole chromosome sets, or complex chromosome rearrangements, not single gene mutations causing huge effects.
And Morgan's work with fruit flies.
Morgan's detailed experiments with Drosophila showed that most mutations actually cause small effects, behaved according to Mendelian rules, and spread through populations via natural selection. This shifted the focus back towards gradualism, powered by small mutations.
So the idea of a single monster mutation creating a new species overnight was largely dismissed. But is there any sense in which saltation, big evolutionary jumps, is relevant today?
Oh, absolutely, just not necessarily via single gene mutations. Modern biology recognizes several mechanisms that can cause rapid, significant evolutionary change.
Like what?
Well, polyploidy, like in de Vries's primroses, is actually a major mechanism of speciation, especially in plants. Gene duplication can instantly provide new genetic material for evolution to work with. Lateral gene transfer genes jumping between different species is huge in microbes and even happens elsewhere.
And things like jumping genes.
Transposable elements, exactly. They can move around the genome and cause significant changes. And think about the endosymbiotic theory, the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts from engulfed bacteria. That's a massive saltational leap through symbiogenesis, the merging of organisms.
So big leaps do happen, just through different mechanisms than originally thought.
Yeah.
That's a great example of an old idea finding new relevance. Okay, so we've covered internal forces, inheritance. What about external events shaping life's history? Or maybe inherent principles of design?
Good transition. Let's start with the external. Catastrophism. This goes back to Georges Cuvier again, around 1812.
Right. His idea that extinctions and changes in the fossil record weren't gradual, but caused by big, sudden natural disasters.
Exactly. Things like huge volcanic eruptions, massive floods, wiping out existing life in an area which would then be repopulated, possibly by migration from elsewhere, leading to the faunal succession seen in rock layers.
And it's important, as you noted, Cuvier explained this through natural catastrophes, not necessarily invoking divine intervention like Noah's flood for each one.
Correct. He saw evidence for multiple recurring natural catastrophes in the geological strata.
This idea was overshadowed for a long time by uniformitarianism, Lyell's idea of slow, gradual geological change being the norm. But catastrophism made a comeback, didn't it?
A huge comeback. The discovery of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event really cemented its place in modern science.
The dinosaur killer.
That's the one. The hypothesis by Walter and Luis Alvarez in 1980, proposing a massive asteroid impact 66 million years ago, caused a global catastrophe and mass extinction.
And then finding the Chicxulub crater in Mexico as the smoking gun.
Precisely. It showed that major catastrophic events do happen and can profoundly reshape the course of life on Earth. It's now a standard part of our understanding.
Okay, so external catastrophes are one factor. What about internal principles of form or structure? That brings us to structuralism, right?
It does. Biological structuralism offers a different kind of challenge to pure Darwinism. It suggests that the forms life takes aren't just shaped by natural selection acting on random variation, but are also guided or constrained by physical laws, principles of organization, and developmental processes.
So it's not denying selection necessarily, but saying other factors related to form itself play a key role, maybe even primary sometimes.
That's often the argument. It has historical roots in thinkers like Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, who talked about shared homologous parts across animals, or Darcy Thompson in his amazing 1917 book on growth and form.
Thompson used mathematics and physics to explain biological shapes, didn't he? Showing how forms could be transformed geometrically.
Yes, suggesting underlying physical and mathematical principles constrain the forms organisms can take. It's less about optimal adaptation and more about what forms are physically possible or likely to emerge.
Who are some more modern proponents or key ideas within structuralism?
Well, you have diverse ideas. Adolf Seilacher proposed mechanical inflation to explain strange Ediacaran fossils. Günter P. Wagner emphasizes developmental bias, how the way organisms develop biases, the kinds of variations that can arise.
And Stuart Kaufman talks about self-organization.
Right. The idea that complex structures can emerge spontaneously from the interactions of parts, following simple rules, without every detail being specified by genes and selected for. Eilenton talks about inherent laws of form, almost like Platonic types.
Then there's Gould and Lewontin's concept of spandrels.
Yeah.
Architectural byproducts.
Exactly. Features that arise as necessary consequences of an organism's overall structure or development, not because they were directly selected for a specific function. Like the space under an arch, it's just there because of how arches are built.
So a feature might exist not because it's adaptive, but just because it's linked to something else that is, or it's just how development works.
That's the idea. Gerd Muller and Stuart Newman even suggest that early evolution, like during the Cambrian explosion, might have been more pre-Mendelian, driven by physical mechanisms and environmental responses before genetic control became so dominant. Brian Goodwin argued pattern formation comes from morphogenetic fields, denying you can reduce complexity just to selection.
It's a very different emphasis. How do mainstream Darwinian biologists respond to these structuralist arguments?
They certainly acknowledge that physics and development place constraints. Things like cell membranes self-assembling are clear examples of self-organization. But they generally argue that while these factors set the boundaries of what's possible, natural selection acting on genetic variation is still the primary engine driving the specific, complex adaptations we see across the vast diversity of life. They question if structuralism alone can explain that level of fine-tuned adaptation.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's shift perspective again, down to the molecular level. How does something like genetic drift fit into this picture of alternatives, specifically the neutral theory?
Right, the neutral theory of molecular evolution. Proposed by Motoo Kimura in 1968, this was a really big deal.
What's the core claim?
Kimura argued that most evolutionary changes at the molecular level, changes in DNA sequences, protein sequences, and most of the variation within species at that level, are caused by genetic drift acting on neutral mutations, not by natural selection acting on advantageous mutations.
Okay, unpack neutral mutations and genetic drift for us.
Sure. A neutral mutation is a change in the DNA that doesn't really affect the organism's survival or reproduction. It's neither helpful nor harmful. Maybe it changes a protein slightly in a way that doesn't alter its function, or it occurs in non-coding DNA.
So selection doesn't see it.
Exactly. And genetic drift is basically just random chance in survival and reproduction. In any generation, purely by luck, some individuals might leave more offspring than others, regardless of their genes. Over time, this random sampling can cause gene variants, including neutral ones, to increase or decrease in frequency, or even become fixed or lost just by chance.
So Kimura was saying most molecular evolution is just random noise.
That's a way to put it. The 1969 paper by King and Jukes, provocatively titled Non-Darwinian Evolution, really pushed this idea using comparisons of protein sequences across species, arguing the patterns looked more like random drift than selection. It sparked a huge debate.
Non-Darwinian. That sounds like a direct challenge.
Mm.
Did Kimura see it as replacing Darwinism altogether?
No, and this is really important. Kimura himself was very clear that his theory applied primarily at the molecular level. He still believed that evolution at the level of the phenotype, the organism's observable traits and adaptations, was largely governed by natural selection.
Ah, so it wasn't an alternative for all evolution, just for what's happening under the hood genetically.
Precisely. It describes a crucially important evolutionary mechanism, especially at the DNA level, but it complements rather than replaces natural selection, which still shapes the organism's interaction with its environment.
Okay, this has been a whirlwind tour through so many different ideas. It raises a question, though. Did scientists back then typically pick just one of these alternatives to champion against Darwin? Or was it more mixed?
That's a fantastic question, and the answer is often. It was much more mixed and complex. These ideas weren't always seen as mutually exclusive. Many thinkers actually blended elements from several different evolutionary philosophies. It really highlights how dynamic and frankly messy the intellectual landscape was before the modern synthesis created a more unified, though not monolithic, framework.
Can you give us an example of someone who really wove these different threads together?
A perfect case study is the American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope. He's fascinating. He started out denying evolution, but by the 1860s, he accepted it, but became a fierce opponent of natural selection as the main mechanism.
Okay, so what did his theory look like? What did he mix together?
Oh, it was quite a cocktail. He incorporated recapitulationism, the old idea that an organism's development mirrors its evolutionary history.
Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
That's the one. He saw this as evidence of a preset plan, which led him directly to orthogenesis. He believed evolution followed fixed, regular patterns, often non-adaptive steps that were part of a larger design.
So a bit of theistic evolution in there, too, with the divine plan idea.
Definitely. He believed in an underlying divine plan guiding the orthogenetic trends. But then, to explain how organisms moved along these preset tracks, he brought in Lamarckism.
Use and disuse driving the changes.
Yes.
Functional adaptation through the inheritance of acquired characteristics was, for him, the mechanism that pushed life along the orthogenetic pathways laid out by the plan.
Wow. Recapitulation, orthogenesis, theism, Lamarckism, anything else?
Yes. He topped it off with his own unique version of vitalism. He called it bathmism.
Bathmism.
It was his concept of a vital growth force within organisms. He thought this force could be consciously or unconsciously directed and concentrated by use and disuse into certain parts of the body, causing them to develop, perhaps at the expense of other parts.
Good grief. It's a lot of different ideas rolled into one. It really is. Cope's view perfectly illustrates how thinkers before the synthesis could weave together recapitulation, orthogenesis, theistic evolution, Lamarckism, and even vitalism into a single, complex evolutionary philosophy that explicitly rejected natural selection as the primary driver. It shows just how diverse the thinking was.
Wow. Okay. That was genuinely a deep dive. It's incredible to think about how many different ways these brilliant scientific minds tried to grapple with the sheer complexity and diversity of life. So many different roads explored before natural selection really took center stage.
It's fascinating. And while the modern synthesis did bring natural selection, combined with genetics, back to the forefront, what's so striking is how elements of these older alternative ideas keep resurfacing in new forms.
Right, like you mentioned with constrained orthogenesis or epigenetics having Lamarckian echoes.
Exactly. And catastrophism is now mainstream. Structuralist ideas about developmental constraints are highly relevant, and even saltationism finds echoes in things like polyploidy and gene transfer. It's not a return to the old theories wholesale.
No, not vitalism or anything.
Definitely not, but it shows that the mechanisms driving evolution are perhaps even richer and more varied than the strictest interpretation of the synthesis might have suggested. Molecular biology has opened up complexities that touch on these older themes in new ways.
And yet, despite biology embracing this selection-driven framework, Our source makes a really interesting final point. It notes that a belief in some kind of inherent progress, a sort of leftover orthogenetic idea, still lingers, not just in the public mind, but maybe even subtly among biologists.
It's a provocative thought. The philosopher of science Michael Ruse has suggested this might stem from our human tendency to seek meaning, or perhaps we project our own sense of scientific and technological progress onto the natural world.
So here's something for you, the listener, to mull over. Is there an inherent direction or progress in evolution? Or is that something we impose on the story? As you think about this deep dive, consider how our very human desire for narrative, for purpose, maybe even for progress, might shape how we interpret the sprawling, branching, and often surprising history of life on Earth.